Ladies and gentlemen, we have a verdict. That verdict is guilty, 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 guilty. I'm not going to say it 34 times. Guilty on all counts. I know it is real. It actually happened. I know it's hard to believe. I'm joined today by a panel of fantastic legal eagles. My experts here. Joining me is Bernarda Villalona and also Diane Kiesel, like Diesel. She tells me every time, Don, it's Kiesel like Diesel. So hello to you guys. How are you?
All right.
Yeah. Diane, how are you feeling after what happened yesterday? Because I wasn't sure. I thought it could go either way. I was not convinced that it was going to be guilty, and it could have been guilty on some charges and not guilty on others, but it was guilty on all 34.
I'm pretty much in shock. I tended to agree with you. I thought, if anything, it would be guilty on the counts, perhaps where Donald Trump actually signed the checks in his big Sharpie. I had less confidence that there would be a guilty verdict on those counts that required entries into the corporate ledger. But be that as it may, despite what Donald Trump said, a fair and impartial jury of his peers found that the people proved their case.
So, Diane, then what's on the table for him? The sentencing is what, July 11th, I believe?
Yes.
Does he just walk away with probation? Do you think he could actually spend time behind bars? I had been actually hearing from attorneys this morning and yesterday evening saying he might actually spend some time behind bars. I don't know. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, he certainly could. The judge has a wide range of sentences on an nonviolent felony, everything from what we call a conditional discharge, which is the equivalent of go and sin no more, all the way up through probation, community service, a fine, and up to 4 years in a state prison. I don't look, sentencing, having been in that position for 25 years, sentencing is one of the hardest, most torturous jobs that a judge has. And in this case, there are a lot of considerations that Judge Merchan is going to have to put in the sentencing pot, if you will. The fact that it's a nonviolent felony, that this is a man with no criminal record, he's almost 80 years old. But that has to be balanced with the fact that this is a man who held the highest office in the land in his hand, right?
Yeah.
And who, according to this jury, got there because in part he cheated.
Yeah.
And then you have to couple that with the fact that, at sentencing, you look for, does the person have any remorse? We're not going to see what we traditionally understand as remorse from Donald Trump here. So I don't know what the judge will do.
Well, I would say, considering everything that you just said, he is in trouble, considering how he's treated the judge, as he talked about the family, how he's talked about Alvin Bragg. He said there was a rigged system yesterday. It was Joe Biden, and the judge was a puppet, and he was corrupt. Bernarda, what do you think? First of all, overall, what do you think of this? And then also, what do you think about the sentencing as well?
Look, Don, I am not surprised by the juror's verdict. All I have to say, one word: accountability. I had been in the courtroom for most of the trial. I saw the opening statements, closing statements, all of Michael Cohen testifying. I saw the jury instructions. I saw when Robert Costello testified. I think there was several blunders by the defense team that they paid big on. So in terms of the verdict itself, Michael Cohen, he came off credible. He came off believable, and he owned up to his flaws. And I think by owning up to his flaws and the prosecution supplying corroboration for his testimony, along with the testimony of David Pecker, I think that went a long way. I had to wait until closing arguments to determine what are the chances of him actually being convicted. And after hearing 4 hours of closing arguments by the prosecution, with how detailed they were in their presentation and putting forth the corroboration, and for me, most importantly, is not vouching for Michael Cohen, but rather saying we accept him for who he is, and that a person like Michael Cohen is the exact person, the ride or die, the fixer, the dirty guy that Donald Trump needed in his camp. And based on that the jury will find him guilty. And getting a few sneak peeks in terms of the testimony that they wanted read back and that they wanted the jury instruction, I was like, when they came back with the verdict, I said, it has to be guilty. There's no way that he'll be acquitted based on all of that. Now, in terms of sentencing, so here, sentencing in New York, I was a prosecutor prosecutor for 13 years, and I've been a defense attorney ever since 2020. So the judge is going to take into account, of course, the purpose of sentencing, punishment, accountability, rehabilitation, deterrence, and take into account aggravating as well as mitigating circumstances, and also take into account the prosecution's recommendation. What is District Attorney Alvin Bragg going to request that Judge Merchan sentence Donald Trump? And also the probation department is going to interview Donald Trump. What's going to be their recommendation? And as well as also the impact statements that's going to be
Bernarda,
presented on the day of sentencing.
Can I ask you something? That was great, by the way. So you think that's going to influence the judge? Would Alvin Bragg and others recommend? Yeah.
Absolutely. Having done so many sentences here in New York, the judge takes their cue from the prosecution. What is the recommendation by the lead prosecutor that represents the people of the state of New York, the county of New York? You are the representative, duly elected representative for the people of the New York County. What is your recommendation for the people of this county? And he's going to take his lead from the prosecution. You notice also that during the gag hearing, the contempt hearing, that DA Alvin Bragg didn't request jail time for those different 11 violations. So the Judge Merchan wasn't going to overstep and say, I'm going to put you in jail for violating this contempt order. Instead, gave him several chances. But here, it's an open book of what he can do. He's going to take into account his speeches, his threats, his acts inside of the courtroom, outside of the courtroom, and his behavior. And all of that is going to play very dearly on Donald Trump. He's not going to have that free ride. I think jail time is a possibility in this case because you have to set a deterrent factor. And here, all eyes are on Judge Merchan on this sentencing. So what is the message that you're going to send to America about this type of behavior? Because it's not just falsifying business records. You defrauded the American public.
Wow. Wow. Bernarda,
One tough
why don't you
judge
say
there,
how
huh?
you really feel? Go ahead, Diane.
I was going to say, Bernard is one tough judge there. You know, one of the things that she points out that is so accurate, all of this information comes to the judge for sentencing, the pre-sentence report, any letters. I would imagine that there are going to be letters and testimonials in favor of Donald Trump from his friends and supporters, and opposing him from people who oppose him. The judge has all of this in front of him before he sentences. However, the judge is an independent actor here. And even if Alvin Bragg steps up and says, I want 4 years in state prison, or I want probation, it is entirely up to the judge. And in my career, there were times that I went along with the DA. There are times when I didn't. There are times when I sentenced a defendant to more time than the DA wanted, or less. This is, and another interesting thing.
But
there are
why
times,
is that? Before you go on, why did you sentence to more? Did you?
Well, at some point, in some instances, I felt that the district attorney was not holding the perpetrator sufficiently accountable. So again, it is purely within the discretion of the judge. Obviously, there are parameters. But one thing I think is important, there have been times during sentencing when I had a certain number or probation or whatever it was in the back of my head. But there is a sentencing hearing, and judges listen very carefully to the evidence presented, as Bernarda just said, from the defense, from the prosecution, from probation. I have changed my mind on that bench based on everything I had heard over the years in some cases. So that's a very, very important hearing.
You changed your mind, you mean during the sentencing when someone pleads their case, depending, and just you wouldn't think about everything that had happened during trial, that just sort of go out of the way, and you said, you know what, in this moment.
I'm sorry. No. What I'm saying is I had sat through the entire trial. I had some sense of who this person was in front of me. I had some sense of the severity or the seriousness of the case. So I had a number in my head, maybe 9 years, maybe 10 years, maybe probation, maybe, you don't know. And then there have been times when I have heard, for example, I did a lot of sex crimes cases, not that this is relevant, but I would hear victim impact statements.
Yeah.
And sometimes that victim impact statement was so powerful and this person's life had been so destroyed that I thought, you know something, maybe I'm not sending a sufficient message to the community that this is unacceptable. And the numbers would change in my head.
I got to
So
tell you, Diane, that I can relate to that because I remember I had to do a victim impact statement from a MAGA Trump supporter who had threatened me and a number of other journalists and high-profile people. And I did before I gave my victim impact statement, I was there with Brian Stelter as well from CNN, and there were some other folks there who had threatened, and we had to get security. And so he was obviously in jail or maybe out on, bond or whatever it was. And the narrative from his attorneys the entire time we were there is that he was a victim, he was a victim of Donald Trump and the rhetoric and the QAnon rhetoric, and they were painting him to be this victim. And had the victims, the actual victims, not been there, I think the judge would have been lenient. And it wasn't until I stepped up there and I lost it. I mean, I started bawling, and I was like, "You, Mister, are not a victim. You're not the victim here." And then, I think his attorneys afterwards said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, paint him as a victim or whatever." But that's what they were going for. And I think he would have gotten a more lenient sentence had it not been for those victim impact statements.
they're very important. And let me tell you, judges listen to them.
They do.
Good judges do.
The judge even said
And
that in his
Ron
ruling.
Rochon is a good judge.
The judge even said that in his ruling, that you're not a victim. And actually the prosecution, called, sent a notice to CNN, an email saying, "We want to thank Don and Brian for whatever, but Don, by you saying he's not a victim, that really impacted the judge," and he even wrote it in his ruling. So you're right. I hadn't even thought about that, Diane. I really hadn't until this moment. So thank you for reminding us and the viewer that. So anything can happen, Bernarda. I just want to know, before we move on, real quickly, before we get too far afield, what happens? Do you know, Bernarda, what happens with that gag order? Is it still in effect, or can Donald Trump basically say whatever he wants to, but should be careful because he's going to be sentenced?
So the gag order is still in effect. And the reason I say that is because it wasn't addressed. It hasn't been addressed since the last hearing. So it is still in effect. There hasn't been any changes to it. But quite honestly, in terms of anything that Donald Trump says, like, we're not dealing with the rules of evidence when it comes to a sentencing hearing. It's going to be used against him. I mean, I'm sure that the district attorney's office is going to be making a list and using their paralegals and still looking through social media and his press conferences as to what he says about his character that goes against who he wants to present himself to be. I'm curious to see on July 11th, on the day of sentencing, because the defendant will be asked, and I said the defendant will be asked if he wants to address the court. Will he say anything? Will he have any remorse, or whether he's going to still proclaim his innocent, which is likely what he's going to do because he wants to preserve his appeal.
Yeah. Do you remember, Bernarda, yesterday were you in court when they read the verdict?
No, I was right outside of court.
You're
I was
right outside.
in court the day before for jury instructions, and when the jurors had the two notes.
Okay, no, because his attorney Todd Blanche argued after the verdict came in that it was improper because of Michael Cohen's testimony.
He was he was just putting arguments out there. So what he wanted to do was a motion to set aside the verdict. So they are going to enter motion practice in the sense that he's going to submit a motion to try to set aside the verdict. And he wants to base it on credibility, but credibility is not one of the grounds to set aside a verdict. So here in New York, you want to set aside the verdict. There are three grounds. Number one, that there was juror misconduct. Number two, a newly discovered evidence. Number three, there was some kind of error during the trial that if it were to get appealed to the appellate division, that it will be automatic reversal. So no, he's not going to win on that. He's going to have to wait until after Donald Trump is actually sentenced and then appeal to the appellate division. He wants to base it on credibility. The issue is that when it comes to making an appeal for the appellate division or the Court of Appeals, they don't address credibility. They are looking for legal errors during the trial to determine whether there is a legal error, not one on credibility, a legal error that prevented Donald Trump from from having a fair trial and hence affected the verdict in the case.
And we have not seen anything like that, a legal error, nor credibility
No,
or anything like
no.
that.
I know. If anything, for his appeal, I think he should go for ineffective assistance of counsel, one of the grounds, because there were fatal blunders, I think, on the defense part, from the opening to arguments to how he cross-examined to putting up Robert Costello to testify. Jesus, that was a fatal flaw right there. It changed the trajectory of the trial itself. I was there in the courtroom when he testified, and I was like, wait, hold up. Why would you put that man to testify when Michael Cohen testified that this attorney Costello was pressuring him and he felt like, he was acting on behalf of Donald Trump and Giuliani, and you kind of had a picture of who this guy was, and it was like, okay, you still have to evaluate Michael Cohen's credibility to determine that that's exactly what happened. But when he put Robert Costello on the stand, I said, absolutely, yes, this man was a double agent and acting for the best interest of Donald Trump, and you can tell that his hands were dirty and that Donald Trump was desperate and wanted to make sure that Michael Cohen didn't flip. And why would you be so concerned that he didn't flip if he didn't have any information about
Wait.
doing
What are you
anything
saying?
criminal?
Are you saying, was this the play? You think the play was, as if I've heard, the play was not necessarily an acquittal or a not guilty verdict. It was for a hung jury.
Yeah, but a hung jury doesn't mean that the case is over, because Alvin Bragg will have to make a decision to retry you. I think if the play was to get a hung jury, probably to save some time and get to November for the election, sure, but that's still not a absolute win, because you can still be retried. And
Right.
even if he were to win, he can't pardon himself because this is a state prosecution, not a federal one.
Okay, but so you said it was what you said. Not prosecutorial. What did you call it? You said representation. Something about representation. What's the play here for?
Ineffective assistance of
Ineffective
counsel.
assistance of counsel, that Todd Blanche made some decisions that I think were fatal to the defense in the
But
sense of
but can't you blame that on Donald Trump? Because don't you think Donald Trump was like, being the puppet master behind the scenes?
Absolutely, because the thing is, if I were Todd Blanche, I hope he really covered himself in his notes and stuff, that he spoke to Donald Trump, and this is something that Donald Trump had directed him to do, and he had explained to Donald Trump that this is probably not a good idea based on my experience of being a trial attorney, to actually put this man on the stand. Because the thing is that they were trying two cases. They were trying a case inside of the courtroom, the criminal case, but also trying the political case inside of the courtroom, and the two don't mesh together. Because if they were focused on just on the criminal case and not focusing about a campaign or an election, you wouldn't have been in your opening talking about absolutely denying what happened with Stormy Daniels. You wouldn't have put Robert Costello to testify, because none of that would have played a role in the deliberations, I think, of the jury when they're considering what case the defense put forward. Because once he started arguing about Stormy Daniels in the opening statement, that's exactly what got you into trouble. And Stormy Daniels was allowed by Judge Merchan to testify about certain details about this sexual encounter when it really didn't matter for the charges. So you didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying that he's going to win on ineffective assistance of counsel, but I think that's one of the grounds that he should put in for.
I want to hear that, Diane, because that's very interesting. Todd Blanche, his attorney, may be the reason that he is granted an appeal. That's really interesting. What do you think?
Well, the law on ineffective assistance of counsel in New York is very, very strict. If your lawyer is breathing at counsel table, chances are you are not prevailing, okay?
Exactly.
And the way the court gets around that is the court will say in a decision, look, these were strategic decisions made by counsel, and the appellate courts will not second guess strategic decisions. I think the appellate issue, and Bernarda, you can tell me if you think I'm wrong on this, I think the jury charge is maybe an avenue of appeal here, simply because it was a unique charge, really a first impression charge of what we call in the trade a bump up. In other words, this started out as a misdemeanor indictment and became a felony because of the underlying intent to conceal another crime. That, I think, could be a more fruitful avenue of appeal, and that I have no idea how both the appellate division and if it went up to the Court of Appeals, how it might rule.
What do you think, Bernarda?
No, I agree. I agree, especially because it's going to be a case of first impression. So I think on that basis, on the jury instruction and having
Mhm.
to put forward that one of the underlying unlawful means is the Federal Election Campaign Act, and that's a federal act, whether that could be applicable to a state prosecution. So I think that's one of the grounds that the appellate division will accept Donald Trump's appeal based on that and give it consideration. So I think that that's probably the strongest argument that Donald Trump has.
Okay, this is what I want to ask you. The former president is out there speaking already, talking about, and that's why I asked about the gag order. He has been speaking live this morning, talking about, that again, it's a witch hunt, that certain people are corrupt. He's saying, I wanted to testify. The theory is that you never testify. As soon as you testify, anybody, if they were George Washington, don't testify because they will get you on something you said slightly wrong and they sue you for perjury. Who wants to respond to that one?
Uh, it's absurd. That's absolutely absurd. First of all, under New York law, whether a defendant testifies is the one thing at
Hmm.
trial that is absolutely under the control of the defendant. Even if it's the stupidest strategic blunder in the world, if the defendant wants to testify, his own lawyer has to permit him to testify.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact he didn't get on that stand was Donald Trump's choice.
You agree with that, Bernarda? Because in the courtroom, were you thinking as you were sitting in that courtroom that, hey, Donald Trump is going to testify?
I was thinking, I was like, if he lets himself be driven by the campaign and the election, he's going to absolutely testify because he's not concerned about the criminal outcome of this case. But what I was saying, it was like, he has no business in testifying. Donald Trump, usually you say you can't be controlled during cross-examination. But first off, Todd Blanche wouldn't even be able to control him during direct examination.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to be open to so much cross-examination as the statements he's made about his book, about his tweets, about his conduct outside of the courtroom. But also, let's not forget that Judge Merchan had made some rulings about the parameters of cross-examination. So if Donald Trump were to testify, the prosecution was allowed to be able to cross him on, guess what? E. Jean Carroll, both of the two civil lawsuits, be
Mm-hmm.
crossed as to the attorney general, that the civil lawsuit, the finding of that, and also be crossed on that he was held in contempt of fines for $5,000 and $10,000 having to deal with Judge Engoron. So he would have been subjected to all of that. But again, Judge Merchan asked him, do you wish to testify? That is your decision to testify and yours alone. Are you
Mm-hmm.
knowingly deciding not to testify? So come on. Again, he's playing to his people. He's playing to the campaign. He's not talking about what happens within those four walls of that
He's
courtroom.
he's saying if he did testify, prosecutors could ask him about everything I ever did.
Lies.
He
Hmm.
said.
Hmm.
What?
No, there was a hearing before trial.
Yes.
Bernarda's done a million of these, a Sandoval
Sandoval.
hearing. And that hearing
Yes.
sets the parameters for what he's allowed to ask and what the prosecutor's allowed to ask. And the judge has to carefully balance between past incidents or events that go to the defendant's credibility and those that are overly prejudicial. And the
Mhm.
judge did, in my opinion, a very good balancing job between the two.
He's saying that Trump says that some of their potential witnesses were literally crucified by the judge.
Huh?
What does that mean? I don't know. But some of their
I don't know.
potential witnesses were crucified by the judge. I'm not
No,
sure what that means.
one witness he wanted to put forward having to deal with an election law, about election law, to talk about campaign. But the problem with that is that that witness would have been severely limited in the sense of he couldn't make a finding as to, in this case, this wouldn't
Mm.
have been campaign fraud. No, because you can't make a conclusion. That's for the jury to make that determination whether there was a violation or not. That's for the fact finder. And then in terms of the law, the judge is the judge of the law, Judge Merchan. So he wouldn't have been able to testify about the law itself. So then they decided not to call him.
Yeah, Diane, how do you think overall that Judge Merchan handled this process, the case, and everything?
think he did an amazing job.
Mhm.
And think about the pressure this man was under. The whole world is watching him, right? First. Two, even though the jurors couldn't look at any news media feed, the judge could go home at night and put his feet up and watch television, right? He has to have known all of the horrible things that Donald Trump was saying about him. Yet, despite that, he didn't hold it against him.
Yes.
He called balls and strikes in favor of and against both parties. He kept his cool, except the one time when he kind of lost it a little bit with Costello, and who could blame him? But for the most, I mean, he was amazing. I don't know how he did it.
Listen, Bernarda, I think that you're agreeing with her from your yes and from the
I,
head nods and whatever.
absolutely,
I
Don.
just want to know then, what do you think about Alvin Bragg? How did he handle himself? I thought his press conference yesterday was pitch perfect. When asked about Donald Trump, he would not respond. He did not give them any ammunition, and he said, "I did my job, and the most important voice has spoken, and that's the voice of the jury." What do you think about how Alvin Bragg has handled this?
Don, I have to say, I have to give praise to Alvin Bragg, for District Attorney Alvin Bragg, for how he handled this case. He let the courtroom and the evidence speak for this case. He didn't do press conferences. He didn't go tit for tat with Donald Trump. He let the evidence speak for
Hmm.
itself inside of the courtroom. No political speeches, nothing at all to go against what Donald Trump was constantly saying about him, how it's
Yeah.
all politically involved. In fact, Alvin Bragg only went into the courtroom. I saw him doing closing arguments. I saw him, I think for briefly for testimony from two of the witnesses, and that is it. But I also have to take into account, I have to give praise to Alvin Bragg for having the courage to move forward with this case.
Hmm.
Because remember, several other officers and district attorneys passed on this case. But District Attorney Alvin Bragg had the courage. He followed the law, he followed the evidence, and he did that without fear or favor, showing that no one is above the law. So, just how we prosecute our Black and Brown sisters and brothers, that same prosecution and same mindset went in prosecuting Donald Trump. So he
Wasn't
held them accountable just like anybody else. And Alvin Bragg had the courage to go forward.
wasn't this the same courtroom or at least courthouse for the Central Park
Yes,
Five?
yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely. Donald Trump. So wait, so the system worked for the Central Park Five where you were condemning them, crucifying them. In fact, took out a front page ad about them, and it was all clap, clap, clap. It worked, but it
Yeah.
doesn't work and apply to you.
Well, I tweeted yesterday afterwards that all of these people who were complaining that this was that he was wrongfully convicted and that this was, what was done was wrong. And I said, look, for all of you people, and they were going to donate more money now to the former president. And even his campaign donation website crashed because so many people were trying to donate. And I said, you know what would be good is that if you guys who are complaining about wrongful convictions, if you could take that money and send some of it to, instead of a rich person, send it to the Innocence Project, who
Yes.
often gets people off of all races, but many of them are African Americans who are 7 times more likely to be convicted, falsely convicted of a crime. And crickets. They didn't understand that. Here's what Alvin Bragg said yesterday before I let you guys go. He said he thanked the hundreds of people who worked on the case. He talked about the thousands of emails, checks, bank statements, or whatever that they had to go over. He said that this was, he thinks that there are model public servants in his office. He thanked the 12 jurors. They made the decision, he said, based on the evidence and the law. And they concluded that there was a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. He said that this was treated no differently than any of the cases that come to in front of them without fear or favor, as you said, Bernarda. And he said no comment on anything Donald Trump, the complaints about him and saying that it was rigged and not real. He said, I did my job. We did our jobs. The only voice that matters is the voice of the jury, and the jury has spoken, and Donald Trump is guilty. So you have an disgraced, one-term former president, twice impeached, liable for sexual assault, now convicted on 34 felony counts. He is a convicted felon. I appreciate all of you for your feedback. And I thank you also, both of you, for joining us. We'll see what happens. The appellate process, well, there's going to be sentencing, right? And in the appellate process, right, Diane, what happens? next?
Yes, once he is sentenced, the clock starts ticking for his lawyers to file whatever appeals they might choose to file. They've got about 30 days to
And
do
certainly
so.
he's going to appeal. They're going to appeal. Okay,
Of course.
but I know this is neither of your wheelhouses or wheelhouse. You think this is going to affect the election, Bernarda?
For his diehard supporters, it doesn't matter. If anything, they're digging out the last 10 cents under their couch to donate. But for those that were on the fence, I think it will affect their decision making. But his
Diane?
diehard supporters, no.
Diane?
I think it's sad that we even have to ask this question, isn't it?
know.
I think back to
Exactly.
50 years ago this summer when Nixon was about to be impeached. Remember, the
And he
Republicans
stepped
said
down.
to him, "You've got no support, Dick. Go." And he did. And look at now. Look at this.
Yeah. Thank you both. I appreciate it. We'll see you next time, okay?
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Don Lemon Show. Make sure you click on the image in the top right to subscribe to my channel and the thumbnail in the bottom right to watch more content from my show. And I'll see you next time.